Welcome to the Esau McCauley podcast. I'm your host, Esau McCauley. Today on the podcast, we have Justin Giboney, the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, and Michael Ware, the founder and director of the Center for Christian Public Engagement, Witness, Inspiration. What is it? Tell me. It's the day after the election, man. I can get that wrong. Tell me what it is, Michael.
Center for Christianity and Public Life.
The Center for Christianity and Public Life. People are going to remember it now because I messed it up. Obviously, we're going to have y'all on to say a little bit about the election, and we're going to get to that. But I thought I would start off the podcast with something a little bit hopeful, not too silly, because this isn't a silly moment in the life of the Republic. But I wanted to ask y'all, if someone said, give me your Mount Rushmore, that means your top 4 either politicians or political figures who inspired you or who are kind of moral guides for you anytime in history, who would they be? Just give me your top 4. We will ask Michael first. At this point in the podcast, Michael Ware gives such a bad list that he texts me later and asks me to remove it. And so here's the list that he wished he would have given you all. And rather than judge him, remember, this brother's working on not a lot of sleep. We're less than 12 to 15 hours out the election. And so his first list was a mess. But here's the better list. His Mount Rushmore are Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Angela Merkel, and William Wilberforce. We love you, Michael. Do better next time. And thank you for coming on the podcast. Okay, Justin, you can repeat some of theirs, but are there 4 who you would list? I think Fannie's going to make your list if I know you well, but go ahead.
I'll go in I would put it up there, but I'll go in a different direction. I'll start local, who I kind of group around. So I'm gonna go State Senator Regis Groff, who was second Black state senator in Colorado. I will go with Mayor Federico Pena, who was a mayor of Denver while I was living there. Frederick Douglass, I gotta put Frederick Douglass in there. I think that's big. And I could go Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman Barbara Jordan.
Okay. Well, I'm going to not answer the question because I'm the host. I'm going to let y'all cook for today. One of the things, and we want to do 2 things on the podcast. I know there's going to be a lot of people who are curious about what happened in this election. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, but then we're going to transition to in the latter half of the podcast, and just to talk about what does the Christian witness look like in the context of this next season of the church's life. And so as I read the polls, I think that most of the polls that we read had it as a toss-up going into the election. And most of them had it tied, and most people said this could go either way. As the results are here, and this is like the end of the day on Wednesday, it's going to look like a relatively decisive victory for Trump. And so maybe the first question that people might want to ask is, how did this happen? What did the polls get wrong? Why did it go decisively in one direction when everybody thought of it as a toss-up?
Yeah, I think I know part of it. I think part of it is pollsters still haven't found a way to really poll all Trump's people. Trump pulls out low propensity voters, which, they just don't get polled the same. And they're people that you just don't even know how to kind of define the demographic. They come from so many different places. And I think they just don't know how to poll those folks. So we saw in 2016, the same thing happened. In 2022, it skewed kind of the other way, but Trump wasn't running. And so I think that messed it up a little bit too. But that's part of it. It's just hard to poll his people because he pulls them from places that normally they wouldn't even vote at all.
Michael, is there anything besides that you might say that is a reason why the pollsters might have gotten it wrong?
Well, I actually, and we're still getting votes in, maybe when I do a deeper, but I actually, the polls weren't that far off. I think the Iowa poll that came out last week that showed Harris winning Iowa by 3 was an outlier that I think really adjusted people's expectations in a way that clearly didn't line up with reality. But I mean, the popular vote even has been close this whole time. There are polls recently showing Trump winning by 4 points, the popular vote. And that's what happened. It's not like these battleground states were complete blowouts. I think this idea that Trump would end up where he was within the realm of data-driven outcomes that folks could look at and really shouldn't have been. And I don't think people were surprised this year in the same way that they were in 2016. I think there was a sense that that this could happen.
Well, I think that maybe I can ask this question as someone who's not a political analyst. It seems like all of the polls had it dead heat in like a percentage point one way or the other way. The fact that it seems like every single swing state is going to be the within the margin of error. Like it was, all of them are going to be within the margin of error from the polls. But it seems like the margin of error was all one way. It'd be different if it was like they're all within the margin of error and 2 states went this way and 2 states went that way. But every single poll, the margin of error was wrong in the direction of like a Trump victory versus a Kamala defeat. And that's the part that seems to be that all of the polls were like 2 to 3% off towards Trump, which seems to be something, and maybe that just gets at what Justice said. Yeah,
and not only that, if you look at blue states, how much he gained in blue states, I don't think they picked that up at all. I mean, he gets 47% in Illinois.
Yeah,
and just to pick up the red wave that he had even in blue states that he didn't win, but he was almost competitive in Minnesota and so on. I mean, that wasn't expected.
Yeah.
So. Maybe that was the question of like the polls, and I know this is we're a day after the election, and what we're talking about here is I want to clear you guys up from getting any emails or anything. This is your analysis as to why people did what they did, not saying that these decisions were right or wise. So I want to make sure we're clear what you were talking about here. Why do you all think that Trump was able to win in the decisive manner that he did? Like, what do you think led to his victory?
Yeah, I mean, the moment the exit polls came in showing, and right, usually you have some real reservations around exit polls, but these were so decisive. You know, if only 22% of the electorate, or it was something like in the 20s, believe we're on the right track, that is usually a decisive factor in the race. If folks feel like the economy has that they have been struggling and that the economy isn't working for them in overwhelming margins, as they did according to exit polls, usually that's going to harm the incumbent party. And so that would be the first thing. The fundamentals of this race were pretty fundamentally were pretty set against Harris. I think the second thing I'd say is, look, it was not healthy, and I've just been clear about this. And there was a lot of pressure when Biden was the nominee to not say anything about Biden. Then all of a sudden it was supposed to be, well, this is a totally natural way for parties to, new information came in. And so obviously the natural conclusion was to replace the Democratic nominee who went through an entire primary process with someone that no one voted for. Like, I just think like you could rationalize all of that. It just wasn't, to use a colloquial term, just wasn't a good look. And especially if you're going to run someone for not respecting our institutions, for subverting processes, for not representing the will of the voters and respecting the will of the voters. Like, it just wasn't a great setup for Harris in the campaign she wanted to run. I could keep going, but those would be.
Do you feel like that within the Democratic Party, Justin, there was pressure, building on what Michael said, to get on board or be quiet? Is that what you're trying to get at, Michael? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Bro, it's always get down and lay down. There's no rule. Either you're with us or against us, right? I mean, that's just how that's how they tend to do it. But I think Mike hits on something very important. You run on democracy, but then you don't model democracy. And too many Christians I know just totally dismissed that as an issue. I think people saw it, and I think people weren't listening to the mainstream media. So all those narratives, they did not care about those narratives. In my opinion, this was, and excuse my language, a middle finger to the establishment. Yeah, I think I don't agree. I couldn't vote for Trump. I don't agree with it. But I'm not one of those people that says, I just can't believe it happened. I just don't understand. I understand why it happened.
Yeah.
You have a bunch of people who are saying, you clean the outside of the cup. And you have all these people, the status quo is riotous. You can tell me about January 6th. I think the status quo is riotous. I think that when everybody lost their homes in 2008 and the banks took them, and when you bailed out the banks and you didn't bail out the people, that's ugly. And Trump may be nasty on the outside and say things like that, but you guys are just the same on the inside. And people had a problem with that. They feel like they've been lied to. I don't necessarily agree with the outcome because I think it's too much chaos with Trump and all the other problems that come with him. I've never said that I don't understand.
I think that one of the things that you're getting at is the ability for us, and I think this is like a general Christian truth here, is that can we be self-reflective, or are we sometimes so committed to our own narratives that we don't see the consequences of our decisions until they're too late?
Right.
And I think that one of the things that, and I talked about this offline, and maybe I'll bring this part online with Justin, I noticed that it was possible for people to push back on like Kamala from her left. So a lot of the people who were concerned with like Gaza and those other things to the left of Harris, they could push back on her. And the far right could push back on Kamala because obviously they're going to have their own issue. But I think there was a huge swath of Christians Christians in particular, who weren't on either one of those particular extremes, who found it, maybe because of the threat of Trump. They thought we can't focus on these other things. The Trump threat for them was so overriding that it felt like it was hard to be reflective on what was happening within the context of the Democratic Party. So that was what I saw as I was just looking at the discourse. I was feeling like, are we being reflective publicly about what's happening and how people outside of our own circles might be perceiving what's going on? Michael, is that accurate at all? Did I miss something there?
No, I think that's accurate. And there was this, you couldn't raise questions until it was clear that they couldn't keep you from raising questions, and then it would be respected. So Michigan, there was a clear electoral need, and all kinds of meetings are being held. Respect is given. Ads are run. But to your point, those who wanted to raise questions like, "Hey, it would be, is she going to back off of the bipartisan immigration compromise?" And there was a season there where it looked like she might. Following the debate, there was a lot of pushback from what's her stance going to be? She rolls out an agenda for Black men that one of the top 3 items was a total legalization of marijuana. Well, anyone who understands what the primary debates are like and what the state of that actual conversation is goes, well, this is something that's deserving of conversation. like this is something that could use some pressure. And instead, a few weeks out from the election, it's being advanced as like a cause that's championing Black voters and Black men in particular. And I think a lot of people were like, well, wait, why are you putting that as something that's representing this constituency when there's a robust debate going on about the wisdom of that? So there are like all of these issues where unless you force the issue and were an electoral threat, unless you were saying, I'm not going to vote for Harris unless this gets addressed, then there was this like, look, we'll deal with all of that later. But you don't want to risk a Trump win. Well, the problem is like that might work with elites, but like voters who don't have who aren't worried about getting fired from their jobs because some staffer at the DNC is upset with them, they're not going to hold to that. They're just going to say, I guess you don't want my vote. I guess like you're telling me to make my voice heard in this election, but every time I raise something, it's an inconvenience to you. I thought you were seeking my vote.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I want to avoid is that it's very easy to look at this election and say, what kinds of things could the Harris-Walz campaign do differently in order to have like won the election, or the Democratic Party to win the election. But for me, as a Christian, my ultimate goal is not to give advice to a particular party on how to win an election. I do want to ask the question of, because a lot of the stuff that you have talked about like seems to be almost not directly related to the church. That like Christianity or Christian ideas weren't necessarily the primary exit poll data. But so I want to ask this question, not saying how could Harris win or why did, like, are there things that we saw in why people are voting that might be important for Christians to know and understand for their own life and faith? Because we talk about like the pro-life issue, we talk about marriage, we talk about transgender issues. What were the kind of salient issues that you think actually decided this election? You said it was the economy, and you said something like whether or not the country's on the good track. Is there things that we can learn from what we are learning that our citizens actually care about?
Yeah, I mean, two of the big issues were the economy, which is big, and I think Christians should care about. You also had immigration, which we know how many times the Bible talks about, the stranger, and those are things that we care about. Then you had abortion. And what was interesting to me was how many Christians were willing to act like that wasn't, if I decide to go to the left and vote for Kamala, I got to act like that's not an issue at all. Yeah. I got to act like the United States, who is way more extreme than France and all these Western European countries on this issue, I got to act like that's not really a big deal, instead of using my leverage to actually push back and maybe say, maybe y'all should moderate again to where you were, maybe in the 90s. So I think you saw quite a few issues pop up to where our values should have a say in it. And I think on both sides, neither side was perfect. You also saw the two sides basically saying we are the Christian choice, which that's a whole nother conversation.
No, I think I want to follow up on that. One of my core theological convictions is that, and now you two aren't, but Justin, are you ordained, Justin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so Justin, me and you might be a little bit different.
I've known him for like 10 years, and he like, I know. Every time we get on this podcast.
I know that you're ordained, but you don't like pastor a church full time. So I know that you're a pastor.
I'm not a senior pastor. No.
And so this would be a little bit different because of the work that you do. And I'm an outlier in this in the Black Christian community. In the Catholic tradition, clergy are forbidden from endorsing candidates. Mm-hmm. And they tell their clergy, you don't endorse candidates. Now, I'm not Catholic, but I'm actually theologically convinced that idea that as a clergy person, not as a lay people, y'all can run out and endorse who you want to do. You can campaign. Even in that tradition, they say that sometimes politicians shouldn't even have office. Clergy shouldn't be in political office. And so for me, as a clergy person, I am in that sense nonpartisan. I don't endorse candidates. I do talk about issues. And I do think that one of the things that has disappointed me that you talked about in this campaign is that we got so caught up in who we were going to endorse and support that we weren't able to actually focus on places where I felt like we could have been really strong on our principles and held both sides to an account. And I think that both sides were just trying to figure out a way to get our vote without giving us very much. And I think that what you were mentioning there is that there are times where Christians need to be able to say to either party, here are the ways in which I don't believe that what you're advocating is good for human flourishing. And the disappointing part that really, I felt like this was, in some sense, of the three kind of Trump elections, this was the most decidedly partisan of from Christians on both sides. And this isn't playing the middle. It's just saying this was a particularly partisan election. And I think it was much less principled and policy oriented as far as the things that Christians talked about. And that could have been because both of the candidates were the narratives around those candidates were largely personality driven. Do you think that's fair, Michael, to say that we kind of lost some of the policy in the midst of this particular election?
I think it's fair, and this is a supplemental point. So this isn't right. You hold both parties to account because that's what faithfulness requires.
Yeah.
The point I want to make is both the campaigns could have used someone holding them accountable. They could have used folks who were willing their good but weren't sycophants.
Yeah.
And, it's just really dangerous to be so caught in this echo chamber of affirmation. Everything you do is the right move, and everyone agrees with you, and everyone who's evil is on one side and everyone who's good is on the other. And you actually, if campaigns don't have people speaking into them that could puncture some of that almost like naturally developing calcification, they suffer because of it. And I think the Harris campaign suffered because of it. I mean, I honestly, I think the Trump campaign suffered to the point that they didn't have that. So I just, again, that's not the point of why you do it. You don't do it to help for the purpose of helping a campaign. You do it because you want the best policies and you want the best leadership and you want the best for the country. But my goodness, the campaigns could have used it, as opposed to people just sort of kind of competing for access, which, I don't mean to cast a spurt, but I just feel like you saw quite a bit of that this time around.
If I could add to that, I think in too many cases, like Michael said, we allowed ourselves to be political props. But what really broke my heart was too many Christian leaders going along with the fear mongering, and scaring people to death. I talked to people who were breaking down, and you had Christian leaders, because they wanted one side to win, were going along with this fear mongering. I could not believe it. That was heartbreaking. I say, if you have one job, is not to get this person elected, it's to make sure this person can. You got people living alone who are scared to death. I know a lady who was a friend of ours. Her mother did not go out the house all day after she voted because she heard that folks were going around beating up old black ladies. Yeah, that's what was going on the internet. The other thing I will say is, to Mike's point, not only should we not be fear mongering, we have a responsibility as Christians to be impartial, not neutral. Impartial, to hold up the same standard to both sides, and that did not happen. And that was heartbreaking, because I saw it from people who are very close to Ann and me, friends and family. I still love them, but it was really disheartening.
Yeah, I can't put this particular person in my life on blast, but I was asking some questions. This was like one of those times where you kind of get offline, you kind of text your way through it, you talk your way through it. And they started talking pointing me. And I'm like, bro, like this is me who we're talking about
bro.
Here. You can't create a policy that's for the poor and human flourishing that I'm not gonna support. Like, even if it's bad economics, if it might help given the tax, I'm gonna do it. I can say that and still say I have these other concerns. And the idea that if you weren't completely on board, you were on the other side. And so I do think that we beat that part to death. I want to ask you this other question though. One of the key narratives that we had here, and I think we may have gotten to it around different way, was that if you were a Christian, and this is probably mostly on the Trump side, that if you were a Christian, you had to vote for Trump. And when I was asking people, what should I poll my two political experts, is I know the election is over, but how do you feel like there is in every election a candidate for whom Christians are morally obligated to support? And the answer is no. How do you decide? What are the limits of human conscience where you say, okay, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it that way. Is there a candidate who, in every election, to be a faithful Christian, you must support that person?
In every election, no. Rarely would that ever be the case, unless you're talking about somebody who's enslaving people or something like that.
Yeah.
What the Bible gives us is a framework, and that framework does have some boundaries. But within that framework, we can have disagreements. We can emphasize and prioritize different things as Christians. And I've said this before. Now, can I completely say, okay, I'm going to vote Democrat, now dismiss the whole sanctity of life issue? No, that's when I think you're unfaithful, right? If you completely dismiss it. But you don't always have to prioritize the exact same thing. Depending on your context, something may be impacting your community even more, And you might want to speak to that. I mean, there's a lot of reasons somebody might have different priorities.
I also had a friend who voted for, they mentioned voting for the Solidarity Party. And here in Illinois, they had, I think they said 5,000 votes in Illinois total. And they wondered, were they wasting their vote? For Christians who do feel morally that they didn't feel comfortable voting for either candidate, do you think that third party voting is a fair moral choice? Or do you feel like, given the system that we have in the United States, they need to just buckle up and make one of those hard choices? Michael?
So I'd say we think about voting as an expression, an unmediated, pure expression of our identity. We treat voting as like a sort of brand statement, but that's not what the vote is. Now, if we treat it that way, it really helps politicians. It really helps the political parties. It's good for them. They want to misplace the moral burden so that your vote is like an expression of the core of who you are. It's expression of everything you want for our society. But the problem is, it's like a gaslighting exercise. They tell you, make your voice heard, but people get into the ballot box, they look at the options and they go, I was told my voice was going to be here, but I don't see it. So what's going on? We want to steward our vote towards the good of our neighbors in the best way as we can discern it. And so the question I would have for folks, the question I was asking leading up to the election, the question I'd ask now is your vote for a third party, is it motivated by the pursuit, by the willing of the good for your neighbors? If out of all the available options, that third party vote is that for you? I want to cast. I might have a political disagreement. We can talk about the practicalities of that, but I wouldn't have a religious judgment on that. I think the real problem is when people are thinking about voting as just making a statement, separate and apart from what their statement, what the effects of that statement would actually do in the lives of their communities, in the life of their community, if their statement actually had its intended effect. So.
Justin, one of the big stories that are coming out of this election, and has been, as best as we can tell, exit polls, we're going to make sure this could turn out differently, was that the large increase for Donald Trump amongst Black and Latino voters. Mm-hmm. Particularly Black men. Are there any reasons why we might be able to understand why this occurred? Is there? I mean, I know there's probably as many reasons there are voters, but are there any trends in Black communities? That's one you feel comfortable with, or you can address both, of why you think Trump has gotten more Black vote than any Republican in living memory, given some of the stuff that he said about ethnic minorities.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of men that just don't find a place in the Democratic Party. And here's why. Obviously, if you look at the history of this country, women have been treated very, very poorly. And there's still things that we need to do to fix that. But in the Democratic Party's rhetoric, and even in some of their policies, they have kind of overcorrected to where you have some men that are in MAGA America that are, their life expectancy is going down. But we're so ideological on the left sometimes when it comes to addressing that, we can't even really consider that. They're not going to college. Their industries are gone. They don't have jobs. They're dying of these deaths of despair. And I think people aren't taking them seriously because we're so stuck on, okay, we have to lean everything to one side or the other, or we have to use certain rhetoric to where it's really, I think, isolating a lot of men. And they're, whether I agree with it or not, they're clinging to something that's more masculine, and they're tired of being criticized, even for stuff that is somewhat natural for men. It seems to sometimes get criticized on the left, and they're pushing back against that. That's my take.
I think one of the questions you might be trying to get at is, how do we address two things at the same time? There's something going on with young men in America. And I think that's been clear in trends of college enrollment, all of these things. And even in the dating life, the dating world, the income disparity between highly educated women, Black women, and less educated Black. Like, I've heard about that as far as the complexities of finding a spouse on similar economic levels because of differences in college enrollment. Like, I've seen that. But it feels like it's difficult to have that conversation when it is also true that women are still victims of sexism and injustice. And how do you both acknowledge the ongoing structural disparities that women face, while at the same time addressing some of the insecurities and real and imagined losses that men are experiencing? And I think that you're right that Trump, this is what I always say to people all of the time. Sometimes any lie will do if you can't find the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that what Trump did is that he tapped into that sense of grievance that was permeating a lot of masculine communities, that even though some of the not some of it, most of the stuff that he prescribed as the solution isn't the solution. I think the fact that some people felt heard is what you seem to be saying led to the shift. Is that the same? Or if the Latino community is like outside of your area of expertise, or Michael, you might have anything to say about that. Do you think the same thing was happening amongst Latino men with the shift from Biden to Trump from 2020 to 2024? Or is there something else going on there, you think?
I mean, I think those dynamics definitely play a role. I think this is going to be a major focus over the course of not just the coming days, but really months. This was Latino voters. That was the fundamental shift in this election. It's actually the overall gender gap wasn't as wide as a lot of people thought it was going to be. Harris didn't win women by as much as many were, suggesting, and Trump actually didn't win men overall by as much as many people were suggesting. To be clear, there was a gap. It's a significant thing to talk about, but it wasn't. People were talking about a 20-point gender gap, which would have been really distressing for social reasons. But Latino voters, there was a profound swing there. I do just want to. I think you have to look at issues like school choice. You have to look at just issues involving the economy. Like you have to look at issues like inflation. I think that we do have a tendency of essentializing demographic groups, because that's how the exit polls come.
Yeah.
Yes, there are particularities with different social positionings, but I think it's also Latino voters many of them did not want to be approached as Latino voters. They're like, why are you talking to me about this? I just want like a job, I just want to a successful Senate candidate, Ruben Gallego in Arizona, actually made a bit of a splash. He's a Latino candidate in Arizona, and he made a bit of a splash because he spoke out against the use of Latinx. It required someone of his social positioning to say, hey, I don't think that's not what I'm interested in. And I don't think that's what a lot of voters in my state are interested in. You had a whole bunch of other people just kind of following along with what the activist class was doing.
One of the interesting things about this, and I think this might be something for pastors, it's really interesting to listen to you all talk about the discourse about what decided the election. And you've talked about like economics. You talked about inflation. You talked about school choice. Obviously, economic policy has spiritual implications, but it's not the thing that we actually spend a lot of time arguing about within the church, right? It's interesting, like we're almost having one set of arguments about issues in the church, and a totally different set of arguments are actually deciding the election. And so as a pastor or as a clergy person, to think about the people flourishing in their communities, you might be, if I'm listening to you well, we might need to attend to the economic flourishing of the people around us. Is that a fair read of saying, what can we do to equip our lay people or people in our churches to be able to get jobs, advance in careers, find ways to get home loans, like those kinds of practical care. Would that be one lesson you could take from the election, like for pastors to think about the actual lives of their people?
I
Yeah,
think they
yeah.
should. I mean, I don't. In that people were concerned about the economy. I guess there's a connection there, but certainly, if given the chance and having the resources, that pastors should try to do that. I mean, that's a type of discipleship in itself and stewardship in itself.
So one of the other questions I get from pastors is they're saying, okay, I'm going to go to church on Sunday, and there'll be people in my church who are super excited about this election. And they're going to be people who are despairing about this election because their candidates won or lost. And had it been the other way, it would have been a different cluster. So for people who are in purple congregations, do you have any advice as to what you might encourage pastors to say or do over the next coming weeks or months around the election?
Yeah. One thing I would say is I think the losers often have a tendency to overestimate how much they've lost. And the winners have a tendency to overestimate how much they won. In the moment when your side wins the election, you actually haven't won anything. And so what you don't want people to do is make it catastrophic so that they're worried about the craziest, most extreme thing that could possibly happen, or people acting like the job has been done. I don't have to do anything else. Your vote is part of your public witness. If that's all you do, you haven't done anything. So just by your candidate getting in, you really haven't done all that much. You got a lot of work to do when it comes to holding them accountable, making sure they're treating people right, and even those people who might have been on the other side. So I would just try to get people, don't get too giddy, but also don't get too down and don't assume the worst. I run into a lot of people who are just assuming the worst. And when you're calling people Nazis and Hitler and all that and garbage and all this other stuff, and we saw that come from both sides, that tends to happen.
Justin, you've said this like 2 or 3 times, and I want to see if I'm going to get some clarity here. I don't think this is the end of the republic. I think the democracy is going to continue. But it would be the concerns that people have is because some of the rhetoric that was around the Republican Party was anti-democratic. And so why wouldn't I be concerned if I heard certain statements that seem to be against normal democratic norms? Is that because you believe that the other systems in place are going to prevent those things from occurring? Or do you think that it was rhetoric? Like, why do you think that we shouldn't be worried about democracy, given some of the stuff that we heard coming from the Republican candidate and the Republican who actually won?
Well, I'm personally concerned, so I don't think I've ever said that you shouldn't be concerned.
Oh yeah, man, personally.
But do I expect that tomorrow we're going to be a fascist state with a dictator and all that? I think that's going a little bit too far. I think our republic has been through more. It's a little more sturdy than that, although we need to keep an eye on it. So I don't take it for granted that something could go wrong. But I understand the system enough to say it's not quite that easy. When I look at the Supreme Court, I don't love every decision they've made, but I do think, that we have somebody who leads it who actually is not going to just vote in a way that would let the republic go up in flames. I just don't see it that way based on my reading of the justices and things of that nature.
Michael, what would you say to pastors who are worried about how they're going to pastor their congregation in a country that seems to be is going to be divided for the rest of at least our political lives? I don't think there's going to be, I think we're in an era of close elections, or at least even this election that came out being close, it felt close during the entire run-up, and it was divided. So as people who are going to have to probably pastor in this divided context for the rest of their ministry in divided churches, what advice would you give to them?
Yeah. So your aim as a pastor is not to promote political uniformity, but spiritual integrity. That's what the unity of the church is based in. And so I think, we talk a lot about this is a moment for bearing one another's burdens. And so whether there are folks feeling haughty and feeling like, to Justin's point, like they just accomplished something really important, or people who are despairing right now, they're in the context of the church. There needs to be a turn towards one another and a laying down of our interests and cares and bearing the burdens of those that we're in community with. And pastors can encourage that. They can, without diminishing the seriousness of political consequences and political decisions. I mean, I am particularly concerned right now. I think we can anticipate, we could pray that it doesn't come true, but we should already be working now around issues of migration and immigrant communities. I mean, I think it's safe to for us to anticipate that World Relief is going to need some support, and the kinds of people that World Relief supports. Sister Norma Pimentel down at the border in El Paso, she's going to need support. Our churches that serve immigrants, that have immigrants as members, that are led by immigrants, they're going to need support. And we shouldn't be just waiting for the crisis to come to be. But to Justin's point, right, there's a difference between being concerned about democracy and saying, this is the last election that we'll have in this country. Like part of the cynicism that grows from that is then when we have the next election, people go, you don't know what you're talking about.
So
why did I listen to you?
So now
there is this sort of like Chicken Little kind of situation that can develop. So we want to be sober minded while taking very seriously threats to justice.
Now you guys are starting to sound like, I mean, you guys have been on point the whole time, but now I think you're getting into this key idea. Is there's a difference between taking threats seriously and being so overcome by fear that you're paralyzed. And you want to say to people that there is still power. One of the things that was really interesting is I had to sit down. I have a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old, and it was really interesting because they're now old enough to have like really nuanced political opinions. And to actually understand in a robust way. When they're younger, you can kind of like, you can explain it, but you're mostly explaining what happens and why it's important. And I remember sitting down with, I mean, this happened last night. This isn't like a long memory. I said to them, I said, listen, when African Americans did not have the vote during slavery, when a significant portion of the African American population was enslaved, there were Black Christians who were pushing against slavery with no cultural political power, with nothing but moral suasion in their own activism. During the Reconstruction, with the anti-lynching stuff that was going on, at the threat of their lives. But once again, no political infrastructure to support them. They resisted injustice. Through the 1960s and 1970s, where they were trying to just register people to vote and push back on the laws. And so I said to them, Christians have a long history within the Black church context of learning how to do faithful Christian politics without all the levers of power supporting them. And so I would say that if there is one thing that we might take from this podcast is, these are serious times that we live in as Christians, but we don't require political power or people in particular offices for us to be about God's purposes. Is there anything else that you might want to say? Here's some stuff that I want you all to take with you into the week as a last word, to how to think about, how to process, how to deal with this election spiritually. We'll start with Michael, and then we'll give Justin the last word.
Yeah. So I have been concerned with this this lack of agency that Christians feel. As I traveled the country this year, people talked as if our politics was merely happening to them. So just the refrain was, I hope my church makes it through election day. I hope my family makes it through election day. Well, like we're here on the other side of election day. We're all standing. If we couldn't take up agency before, this is really the time where people need to decide, rather than just taking and accepting what politics is giving to me, what is the positive vision I have for how our political context could be one in which I am growing in Christ-likeness. as opposed to this constant deferral of, well, I'll worry about formation. I'll worry about growing in Christ-likeness after the crisis, after the political crisis of the moment. Like, they will just keep coming. Like, there is no pause button in the political moment. Formation is for when you're in the very thick of the battle, and we're in it now. And so I would just encourage Christians to think about, what does it mean to stop reacting to everything our politics throws? And what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of person is Jesus calling you and your families and your churches to be now, in this moment? And then make the intention and take up the means to follow that vision.
Yeah, I would say, number one, it's okay to be sad right now, to be upset. I mean, this was consequential. So don't let anything we said say this wasn't consequential. It was, and there's going to be, some results. You get what you vote for.
Yes.
But at the same time, I want people to look around them and look at what they can do locally. One of the bad things that I've seen is everything has become about the national election. But really, when you look locally, you have a more direct impact on what's happening to you. So you might not feel so hopeless. See what you can do on a local level. And I want to tell you this. If you and your church are careful and diligent, you can have a greater impact on the community around you than the president does. And I hope that's encouraging and empowering.
Now, I'm going to say this too, because y'all don't have to do it. Both of these men run important nonprofits that are doing the work of Christian public witness in the world. So if you don't know what to do, you can give them some money. So I want you to go to the AND campaign. Is it andcampaign.com? That's okay. Google it. .org. And there's probably a donate button. I'm completely serious. I donate to the AND campaign regularly, so I'm not just talking about it. I'm living that life. And Michael, I'm sure if they go to your website, they can find there's a give button too. And I know that you currently have a book called The Spirit of Our Politics. That's correct?
That's right.
And Justin, your new book isn't out yet, because I'm still getting copies on it. But I wish I could tell y'all to get that one, because that one's when it comes out, you should get it. He's working on the classic. But the one that you put out with the AND campaign, what was it called? The Election Guide? What's the name of that one?
That's both of ours. It's me and me and Michael. Compassion and Conviction.
Yes.
It's the AND campaign's guide to faithful civic engagement.
So both, if you want to say, what can I do?
And Chris Butler.
What can you do practically? These are two Christian organizations that are out there doing the work of combining gospel faithfulness with thoughtful politics in their own ways. They're not doing the same things. You can support them. You can follow them on social media. You can give them money. And if you broke, you give them a little bit, but then you call your rich friends to get them to give them some money. So if you want a better politics has to be funded. And I want to say that both of these men are engaged in that work. And thank you all for coming on the podcast and help us process what's happened over the last couple of days. The Esau McCauley Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media, produced by Mike Stay Low, Stray Low. If you know, now you know. Edited by Seth Gorbett, like a Corvette. Music by Rob Knorr. Make sure to follow the show wherever you get your podcast and leave a review so more people can find it. See you next time. I'm out.
I'm penning these letters with prayers they can aid your endeavors. It's clever benevolence, tasted it, wrestle with, still wrestling. Touch my side and it crushed my pride and told me I'm blessed within. Receive a Christian platitude with gratitude, but in the saddest news I live in doesn't add up to the Beatitudes. Catch me in the catacombs, chiefing like they Pat Mahomes, catching bullets, tackle foes, running plays, defending zones. Field got them doing football numbers, only half is grown. He was acting grown.